On March 8, 1943, at 08:23 hours over the Normandy coast, the roar of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine cut through morning fog. Major Frank Buck Cunningham of the 56 Fighter Group flew his P-47C Thunderbolt at 12,000 feet, throttle steady, formation tight. Intelligence had predicted light resistance. The Luftwaffe was supposedly conserving strength for the Eastern Front. But through broken cloud at 10 o'clock, a Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 appeared. Sharp, fast, aggressive. Cunningham's wingman called the brake. The Thunderbolt banked hard, its 7-ton mass absorbing 4 Gs without complaint. 8 Browning M2 machine guns opened fire. Tracers arced across 600 yards. The Bf 109 took hits along the wing root and fuselage, trailing white coolant vapor before spiraling earthward. In the after-action report filed that evening, Cunningham noted the encounter lasted 47 seconds. The Luftwaffe had not expected the P-47 to turn inside them. By January 1943, Republic Aviation's factory in Farmingdale, Long Island, had delivered over 400 P-47 Thunderbolts to the Army Air Forces. Chief Engineer Alexander Kartveli stood in the assembly hangar at 14 odd hours, watching riveting crews secure the final fuselage panels on aircraft serial number 416205. The P-47 weighed 13,000 pounds empty, twice the mass of a Supermarine Spitfire. Critics in the Air Ministry and among operational squadrons had questioned whether such a heavy fighter could survive modern air combat. Some called it a flying milk bottle. Others doubted the turbocharged R2800 engine could deliver promised performance above 20,000 feet. Kartveli ran his hand along the armor plate behind the cockpit, 1 inch of hardened steel, capable of stopping 20 mm cannon shells. The wing spars were built to withstand 12 Gs of stress. Factory tests had subjected the airframe to loads that would have torn apart lighter designs. On his desk lay a cable from the European theatre requesting immediate delivery of 2 additional fighter groups. He folded the message and placed it in his jacket. The war would settle the argument. On April 15, 1943, at 09:17 hours, Major Cunningham led 4 P-47Cs across the English Channel on the type's first operational fighter sweep over occupied France. Altitude was 24,000 feet. Outside air temperature registered minus 32 degrees Celsius. The turbocharger maintained manifold pressure at 52 inches of mercury, delivering 2,000 horsepower to the 4-bladed propeller. Visibility extended 40 miles in clear spring air. At 09:34, ground control transmitted a warning. Bandits, Angels 20, you're 6 o'clock, closing fast. Cunningham initiated a hard right brake. The P-47's control response felt heavy compared to the nimble FW-190s he had trained against in mock combat, but the airframe remained solid through the turn. Behind him, 3 Bf-109G4s closed to firing range. Cunningham pushed the throttle to war emergency power and dove, accelerating past 400 miles per hour. The Messerschmitts followed. At 18,000 feet he pulled back on the stick. The Thunderbolt climbed steeply. 2 Bf-109s overshot, unable to match the climb rate. Cunningham rolled inverted and fired a 2-second burst. His guns hammered out 120 rounds. Strikes walked across the nearest 109's engine cowling. Black smoke erupted from the cylinder banks. The German fighter fell away, trailing fire. By the time Cunningham's flight returned to base at 11:05, they had claimed 2 confirmed kills without loss. In the debriefing room, intelligence officers recorded the engagement. The P-47 had performed beyond expectations. At Luftwaffe Command Headquarters in Berlin, Oberstleutnant Heinrich Müller reviewed combat reports at his desk on the afternoon of April 20th, 1943. Radio intercepts and pilot debriefings indicated a new American fighter had entered operational service over France and the Low Countries. Initial assessments described it as large, heavily armed, and surprisingly fast at altitude. Müller adjusted his reading glasses and studied the intelligence summary. One line caught his attention. Enemy aircraft absorbed multiple cannon strikes and returned to base. This contradicted established doctrine. Luftwaffe fighters relied on speed and firepower to destroy Allied bombers and their escorts quickly. A fighter that could sustain damage and continue fighting disrupted those calculations. Müller stood and walked to the situation map covering the eastern wall. Red pins marked recent engagements. Blue markers indicated Allied air activity. The pattern showed increasing American fighter presence along the Channel coast. He underlined a note in the margin of his report. Armored cockpit, self-sealing tanks, radial engine, difficult to disable with single pass. At the daily briefing 2 hours later, Müller presented his findings to the operations staff. General Major Josef Schmid listened without expression, then asked about countermeasures. Müller hesitated. Standard tactics assumed enemy fighters would disengage after taking damage. The P-47 did not. Schmid tapped his pen against the table twice. "We will adapt," he said quietly. But Müller noticed doubt in the general's eyes. The Americans had fielded something unexpected. On May 14, 1943, at 06:30 hours, Sergeant John Myers of the 78th Fighter Group prepared for his third mission of the week. The target was a German supply convoy moving through the Apennine Mountains in northern Italy. Myers stood beside his P-47D-1, checking the external fuel tank mounted beneath the fuselage. The added capacity extended range to 475 miles. Enough to reach the target and return with combat reserve. Ground crew had loaded 6 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets under the wings, 3 per side. Each rocket carried 60 pounds of high explosive. The briefing officer had warned about concentrated flak positions along the convoy route. Myers climbed into the cockpit at 6:52. The instrument panel glowed amber in pre-dawn darkness. Engine start was routine. Battery on, fuel boost, magnetos both, mesh engage. The big radial coughed twice and settled into a rough idle, then smoothed as oil pressure climbed. By 07:15, 8 Thunderbolts lifted off and formed up heading southeast. At 08:10, they crossed into enemy territory at 14,000 feet. Smoke from German positions marked the valley ahead. Myers tightened his oxygen mask and armed the rockets. At 8,000 feet, black puffs of flak burst around the formation. The P-47 shuddered as shrapnel struck the left wing, tearing through aluminum skin. Myers held his heading. At 4,000 feet, he pickled the rockets in sequence. White trails arced toward the convoy below. Explosions rippled along the road. Trucks scattered. Myers pulled up hard, feeling the airframe groan under load. By 09:30, all 8 aircraft had returned to base. 3 showed significant flak damage. All were repairable. At Eglin Field, Florida, on June 2, 1943, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Scott assembled a team of engineers and combat veterans to evaluate P-47 performance data from the European theatre. The conference room held 30 men, pilots, ordnance specialists, and Republic aviation representatives. Scott placed a damaged wing panel on the table at 10:12 hours. Bullet holes punctured the leading edge in a tight group. This aircraft absorbed 27 7.92mm rounds and 14 20mm strikes, Scott said. Pilot returned safely. He pointed to the self-sealing fuel tank sample beside the panel. The rubber liner had closed around entry holes automatically, preventing fuel loss and fire. Scott moved to the blackboard and sketched a P-47's profile. Current doctrine emphasizes high-altitude escort, he explained. But field reports indicate the P-47 excels at low-level attack, ground targets, trains, airfields. He wrote numbers in chalk. 8 50 caliber guns, 350 rounds per gun, rate of fire 800 per minute combined. The room absorbed the mathematics. One pilot raised his hand. What about dive performance? Scott consulted his notes. Terminal velocity exceeds 500 miles per hour, structural integrity maintained. The engineers nodded. The discussion shifted to ordnance loads. Scott outlined proposals for increased rocket and bomb capacity. By 50 the group had drafted recommendations for tactical modifications. That evening, Scott typed a summary cable to 8 Fighter Command headquarters in England. P-47 capabilities exceed initial projections. Recommend expanded ground attack role. The reply came 3 days later. Approved. Over Berlin on July 28, 1943 at 15:27 hours, Major Cunningham led 16 P-47Ds on a bomber escort mission. Below at 22,000 feet, 36 B-17 flying fortresses maintained formation, approaching the city's industrial suburbs. Flak filled the sky, black clouds bursting in geometric patterns. Cunningham scanned the horizon through his canopy. At 15 miles out, ground control reported inbound fighters. 30 seconds later, a formation of Focke-Wulf FW-190A5s dove from altitude, targeting the bomber's low squadron. Cunningham transmitted, "Razorback flight, engage." The Thunderbolts peeled off, diving to intercept. Speed built rapidly. At 450 miles per hour, the P-47s overtook the German fighters. Cunningham centered his gun sight on the nearest FW-190 and pressed the trigger. 8 streams of tracer fire converged. The Focke-Wulf's left wing disintegrated. It tumbled away, trailing debris. Around him, the dogfight spread across 5,000 feet of vertical space. A P-47 took cannon strikes in the engine, but continued flying, oil streaming from damaged cylinders. The pilot maintained formation. By 1541, the FW-190s broke contact and dove away eastward. Cunningham counted his squadron. All present. Below, the B-17s pressed toward the target. Flak intensified. One bomber took a direct hit and fell out of formation, 3 engines burning. Cunningham watched it descend, parachutes blossoming behind it. At 16:10, the bombers released their loads over the target area. Secondary explosions marked hits on industrial buildings. The formation turned west. Cunningham's squadron remained overhead until the bombers cleared the city's defences. In the mission report filed that evening, intelligence noted, "Enemy fighters showed decreased willingness to engage heavily armed escorts." By August 17, 1943, 8th Air Force had lost 116 heavy bombers during the preceding month of operations over Germany. At High Wycombe, England, General Ira Eaker studied loss rate projections at his desk. Current attrition exceeded replacement capacity. Without effective fighter escort deep into Reich territory, daylight bombing could not continue. The P-47's combat radius with external tanks reached 475 miles, enough to protect bombers to the German border, but not beyond. Eaker had requested long-range escort fighters repeatedly. North American's P-51 Mustang showed promise but remained in limited production. For now, the P-47 carried the burden. That afternoon, Eaker flew to Duxford to observe 78th Fighter Group operations. He arrived at 13:45 and walked directly to the flight line. 16 Thunderbolts sat in revetments, ground crews swarming over them. Eaker stopped beside one aircraft. Scorched paint marked gun blast patterns around the wing roots. Patched bullet holes dotted the fuselage. The crew chief, Staff Sergeant William Harmon, stood on the wing adjusting the gun sight. Ika climbed the boarding ladder. Harman snapped a salute. "Sir?" Ika waved him back to work. "How's she holding up, Sergeant?" Harman tapped the armor plate behind the pilot's seat. "Took 3. 20mm hits yesterday. Didn't penetrate. Pilot walked away." Ika nodded slowly. He ran his hand along the control stick, feeling the worn grip tape. In the distance, engines started in sequence, a rolling thunder across the field. 4 P-47s taxied toward the runway. Ika descended from the cockpit and watched them take off, climbing steeply into overcast sky. That evening, he drafted a cable to Washington. P-47 proving essential, request priority production increase. The reply authorized 2 additional fighter groups. On September 6, 1943, at 09 Dars hours, the 56th Fighter Group launched 24 P-47Ds from Halesworth Airfield in Suffolk. Their mission, destroy a Luftwaffe fuel storage depot near Lille, France. Weather was marginal. Broken clouds at 8,000 feet, visibility 6 miles. Major Cunningham led the first flight. Each aircraft carried 2 500-pound general-purpose bombs on wing racks. The formation crossed the English coast at 09:23 and descended to low altitude over the channel, flying 50 feet above the water to avoid radar detection. At 09:47, they climbed to attack altitude inland. Ground defences opened fire immediately. Flak bursts tracked the formation. Cunningham pushed throttle to maximum continuous power. At 12,000 feet, he rolled inverted and dove toward the target. The depot appeared below, 6 large fuel tanks surrounded by revetments and anti-aircraft positions. Cunningham pickled his bombs at 4,000 feet and pulled up hard. The bombs struck the nearest tank directly. A massive fireball erupted, followed by secondary explosions as adjacent tanks ignited. Black smoke climbed to 15,000 feet within seconds. Behind Cunningham, successive flights delivered their ordnance. By 10:15, the entire depot was engulfed. German fighters appeared. 8 Bf-109s diving from altitude. The Thunderbolts jettisoned empty bomb racks and engaged. The dogfight lasted 7 minutes. 2 P-47s sustained damage but remained airborne. 3 Bf-109s went down. At 11:32, the formation landed back at Halesworth. Reconnaissance photos taken later that afternoon showed the depot completely destroyed. Estimated fuel loss exceeded 2 million litres. In Luftwaffe operations logs, the attack was recorded as catastrophic. German commanders began relocating fuel reserves to dispersed, hardened sites. The P-47 had become more than a defensive escort. It was now an offensive weapon striking deep behind enemy lines. At 11:57 hours on March 6, 1944, over central France, Major Cunningham led 48 P-47D 25s on a fighter sweep ahead of bomber formations targeting aircraft factories near Bordeaux. The Thunderbolts cruised at 26,000 feet. Above the operational ceiling of most Luftwaffe fighters, intelligence had predicted heavy opposition. At 12:14, ground control transmitted, multiple bandits, Angels 22, heading west, approximately 60 contacts. Cunningham acknowledged and adjusted course to intercept. 6 minutes later, the formations merged. German fighters came in 3 waves, Bf-109G6s and FW-190AA8s, climbing aggressively. Cunningham selected a target and dove. Speed increased past 430 miles per hour. The Bf-109 pilot saw him and tried to brake left, but the P-47's momentum carried Cunningham inside the turn radius. He fired a 3-second burst. Strikes hammered the 109's cockpit area. The canopy shattered. The aircraft fell away without control inputs. Around him, 30 individual engagements unfolded simultaneously. Radio traffic compressed into urgent fragments. Brake right. On your 6. Got one. Take the shot. A P-47 exploded to Cunningham's left, a direct hit from a 30mm cannon. The pilot did not bail out. Cunningham reversed hard, searching for the attacker. An FW-190 flashed past, trailing gun smoke. Cunningham rolled inverted and pulled through, lining up the shot. His remaining ammunition, 400 rounds, poured into the Focke-Wulf. The German fighter's tail section separated. It tumbled earthward. By 12:31, German formations broke contact and scattered. Cunningham counted his squadron. 41 aircraft remained. 7 showed combat damage. In the after-action summary filed that evening, Freight Fighter Command recorded 43 enemy aircraft destroyed, 16 probables. Allied losses totaled 6. The ratio had shifted decisively. Luftwaffe's strength over occupied France was eroding. At Republic Aviation's Evansville, Indiana plant on April 6, 1944, production supervisor Margaret Klein walked the assembly line at 15:30 hours, clipboard in hand. 300 workers, many of them women, operated rivet guns, welding torches, and hydraulic presses across a floor measuring 800 feet long. Every day, the facility delivered 9 completed P-47 airframes. Monthly output had reached 270 aircraft. Klein stopped at Station 17, where fuselage sections were mated to wing assemblies. Riveter Alice Brennan secured aluminum panels with practiced precision. Klein checked the quality log, 0 defects for the past 6 days. She marked the sheet and moved to the engine installation bay. Pratt & Whitney R-2800s arrived by rail from East Hartford, Connecticut. Each engine weighed over 2,000 pounds and produced 2,300 horsepower with water injection. Installation required 12 workers and 4 hours. Klein watched as Crew Chief Thomas Morton guided the latest engine onto its mounting frame. Every motion was choreographed. By 17 Mo, the engine was bolted in place, cowling panels fitted, control cables connected. Morton signed the inspection form. That evening, Klein typed the daily production report. 9 aircraft completed, 0 defects, schedule maintained. She added a note at the bottom. Workers request confirmation that aircraft are reaching combat units rapidly. The question had circulated through the plant for weeks. Klein submitted the report to management. The reply came the next morning. Every P-47 from this facility is operational in theatre within 30 days. Klein posted the message on the main bulletin board. By lunch break, every worker had read it. Production tempo increased. On June 6, 1944, at 07:15 hours, elements of the 78th Fighter Group flew their first mission over Normandy beaches. The invasion had begun 3 hours earlier. Sergeant Myers led a 4-ship flight on armed reconnaissance along the coastal highway between Caen and Carentan. Below, Allied landing craft approached the shore through rough seas. German defensive fire filled the air with tracers and explosions. Myers descended to 6,000 feet and searched for targets. At 07:28, he spotted a column of German armor moving toward the beach defenses, 8 Panzer IV tanks and supporting vehicles. Myers radioed the contact and rolled in. His P-47 carried 6 high-velocity aircraft rockets and full .50 caliber ammunition. At 3,000 feet, he fired 2 rockets. White smoke trails converged on the lead tank. Both struck. The Panzer stopped moving, smoke pouring from hatches. Myers pulled up and came around for a second pass. This time he used guns, raking the column with sustained fire. A fuel truck exploded. Secondary fires spread to adjacent vehicles. Behind him, 3 more P-47s attacked in sequence. By 07:35, the German column was immobilized. Myers climbed back to patrol altitude. Throughout the morning, Thunderbolt squadrons flew continuous missions over the beachhead. At 12 Myers landed at a newly established forward airstrip near the coast. steel matting laid across a farmer's field. Refueling took 12 minutes. By 12:30, he was airborne again. That day, the 78th Fighter Group flew 83 sorties. Enemy air opposition over the beaches was minimal. Luftwaffe fighters, facing overwhelming Allied air superiority, stayed inland. In tactical reports filed that evening, ground commanders credited P-47 strikes with preventing German armoured counterattacks during critical hours. The beachhead held. At 07-hour hours on May 8, 1945, Major Frank Cunningham stood on the flight line at Boxstead Airfield, England. The war in Europe had ended at midnight. Ground crews secured aircraft in their revetments for the final time. Cunningham walked to his P-47D-28, serial number 44-20371. He had flown this particular aircraft for 8 months, through bomber escort missions, ground attacks, and air-to-air engagements. The name, Lucky Strike, was painted below the cockpit in faded yellow letters. Cunningham ran his hand along the fuselage. Patched bullet holes, scorched paint, and dented panels told the story of 37 combat missions. He climbed onto the wing and looked into the cockpit. The control stick was worn smooth. The throttle quadrant showed scratches from repeated use. On the instrument panel, someone had taped a small photograph. Cunningham's wife and daughter, taken 2 years earlier. He removed it carefully and placed it in his jacket. Behind him, other pilots gathered around their aircraft. No one spoke. Engines that had roared daily now sat silent. At 08:30, the squadron commander called formation. He read a message from Vate Fighter Command. Hostilities concluded. All units stand down. Brief. Factual. The formation dispersed. Cunningham returned to his quarters and wrote a letter to his family. It's over. We did what we came to do. He mailed it that afternoon. In the months that followed, most P-47s would be scrapped or sold as surplus. A few would find homes in museums, but on that morning in May, they sat quietly on English airfields, their work complete. In August 1945, the United States Strategic Bombing Survey published its assessment of air operations over Europe. The report occupied 732 pages and included detailed analysis of aircraft performance, loss rates, and tactical effectiveness. Section 4, paragraph 23, addressed fighter operations. The P-47 Thunderbolt performed critical roles in achieving air superiority and supporting ground operations. Its combination of firepower, range, and survivability proved decisive. The report included statistics: 15,183 P-47s produced during the war, 3,752 lost in combat, 11,874 enemy aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat, 86,000 railway locomotives and vehicles destroyed in ground attack missions. The numbers represented thousands of individual actions: pilots, mechanics, engineers, factory workers. In Luftwaffe archives captured after the war, Allied intelligence officers found a technical assessment dated November 1944. The document, prepared by German engineers, evaluated American fighter capabilities. One section focused specifically on the P-47. The conclusion was direct. This aircraft achieved dominance through superior production capacity, pilot training, and operational endurance. No comparable Luftwaffe fighter could match its combination of range, firepower, and structural strength. The assessment noted that German fighters, constrained by fuel shortages and pilot attrition, could not sustain operations against the P-47's continuous presence. A handwritten note in the margin, author unknown, read, "We underestimated American industrial capacity." The file contained no recommendations. By November 1944, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The P-47 had not been the fastest or most maneuverable fighter of the war, but it had been present, reliable, and devastating. In the end, those qualities decided the contest. The file was archived without further comment. The war had already written its conclusion,